Back to finish the chair up. So of course, new day, we want to come in and we want to do our file, and we want to set our project, right? We're not creating a new project because we've already done it for project 4, and we still have another to finish this model up and then build another one for project 4. So we just go to set project, right? File set project. And then we can just go find project 4, which is right there. Hit set, there we go, and our project's set. And then of course we go to file open scene, and there it takes us right to project 4 scenes, and there's the chair. We open that up. Usually hit don't save there, continue, and there is our chair. And of course it loads in the picture as well, because the picture is actually in the source images folder of that project, and so it always knows where to look for that stuff, right? That's really why we're using projects. If you're just on your computer at home, you can probably get by without a project, but in particular they're useful for, like you said, if you're moving around to different computers, everything being on one project, it makes it a lot easier to move, and then when you set the project and load a scene in, that scene knows where to find any external files and load them in, because they're in that project that project's set to, and it uses all those directories. So any images, textures loaded in. Alright, so we left off having built a lot of the chair, right? We kind of built a little underbrace, we built kind of the spokes, we got to talk a lot about, if I hit W for move tool, right, we got to talk a lot about how these move settings work, and how we can orient a component, or even edit pivot for custom, that you can numerically type in values, or even use kind of snap features to kind of give you some more localized control over the spokes, right? And that's one of the cool things about this part of the chair, is it really kind of lets us take a look at this. A lot of what we do this semester, we don't really need that a lot, right? You don't really need those that much when you're modeling, but it is one of those things that you definitely sometimes need it, and it's great to have it when you want it. Maya's version of these are solid. They're not bad. They're pretty easy to use. They're not quite as robust as I'd like them to be. I've seen better in like Blender or Modo. 3D Studio Max is about the same, but just about all packages give you some ability to kind of reorient their manipulators or reposition their manipulators. So you're always going to kind of be in a solid position for that stuff. Even though you might find some extra little cool tricks in other software, like, oh, that's neat, right? But the basics are the same on all the software, right? And this just gives you that ability to pick different orientations for your manipulator. And we're not trying to be exhaustive about all of these. Some of these are highly specific, super useful in very rare circumstances. The ones that you'll probably use the most will be things like world, object, component, or custom, which is just your edit pivot. All right, so that's where we left off, and really what we need to do is make the wheels. These guys right here, those are really easy to make, like that kind of thing right there. It's the kind of thing where you could seriously just make a cylinder, right? Maybe give it, in this case we'll just say like maybe 12 divisions, right? And you can make it smaller, and I'm going to leave that up to you guys because yours might not even have that. I'm just going to quickly kind of sketch it, if you will, just to kind of give you an idea of it. Of course, you can keep it low res if you wanted to. You can put it in the smooth preview. It's kind of up to you, right? You can always put a few multi-cuts in just to kind of give you a little bit more geometry there, right? Just to kind of sharpen it up. And then if you wanted to, you could really just go to like, something like face mode, right? Hold down right mouse button, face selection. And you could really just kind of skip every other face, right? And you can extrude those out along normal direction, right? Just like we did for our spokes, right? Just to create that knobbing, right? And if you wanted them to kind of be all at the same time, that would be one of those things where we probably would just take this edge loop out, right? Remember, Control Delete takes edge loops out. Control Delete. Remember, that's just edit mesh, delete edge vertex, Control Delete. It takes the edge loop out and the vertices. Normally, regular delete will be fine if it's like a single edge, if it's an object, if it's a face, that's fine. If it's an edge loop or part of an edge loop, you really need to use Control Delete because that'll take the vertices with it. Otherwise, it leaves the vertices behind. And we've seen that in earlier videos. But in this case, maybe we just select the face, shift double click on a face, and then I could just extrude, move it along normal direction, and then turn keep faces together off, right? And then we can kind of make those little kind of knobs there. If you wanted to sharpen them up, you can go and add some multi-cuts in later on. And that kind of gives you a pretty good idea of how to make that. Yours might not have that, right? So that's kind of one of the reasons why I kind of leave this kind of as more of like a, hey, you know how to do this. And that gives you kind of a quick example of that, right? And in my case, I'll just kind of leave it as a simple, quick one. Move into position here. Remember R for scale, W for move. I'll just rotate a little bit just to kind of get me something in there that's kind of like that, right? And you'll notice that because I've rotated the object, right? You notice how the object itself has rotation? I was rotating the actual object. You'll notice that particularly if you were to say set to world, right? World lines it up to the actual world axes. And that's a good default. You're going to use that a lot of the time. But you'll notice that object actually lines up to the object's orientation. So it's kind of like world, but for the object itself. So if you've rotated an object, that's what object does. So you'll see kind of neat, right? So if you ever need to, or you want kind of to manipulate it based on an object, that's what object does. You have to have changed these values though at the object level, right? If I was to do this at the face level, right? So if I was to go in here and select those faces and rotate them, you'll notice that even in object mode, you see how the actual object doesn't line up to it anymore because I rotated all the faces. So keep in mind that that really has to be an object level transformation, right? You have to have had actually rotated and moved it at the object level, right? At object mode. And then that's when your object level will kind of work, right? Kind of cool, kind of cool. Like I said, you guys might not have that, so that was just, I just wanted to do like a super quick sketch for you guys, just kind of get you guys seeing that really quick. There we go, just a really simple sketch for that. But you notice how that was nothing new, right? That was really just a cylinder. We extruded some out, right? Keep faces together off. We've seen all that stuff before. And it was a great way to kind of talk about object transform mode as well. Kind of a neat way to see how that's a little bit distinctly different. We didn't really need it or have a reason to work differently than world here. But on this one, because we rotated it, we kind of got to see that, you know, object is a bit distinct from world. All right. And of course, this right here is really just a cylinder with some edge loops bent on there, and then kind of like a little end guy here, right? That's quite easy. You know, we could easily create a cube. All right, we'll kind of move this out a little bit, scale it down a lot. And like I said, once again, these are kind of little sketches for you guys, because you really know how to make these things. It's one of those things you think you don't know how to make it, and it's like you totally know how to make it. Everything you've done before, you can make these, right? And if I want, I can of course hit 3. Remember, Alt left rotates your camera. Alt middle moves your camera. Remember, middle is your scroll wheel, right? If you look at your mouse and you've got 2 buttons and a scroll wheel, and you think I don't have a 3-button mouse, you do, right? That scroll wheel can act like a mouse button. You just press it down instead of using the scroll part of it. And of course, Alt right zooms. Remember, Alt and your mouse buttons do your navigation, just like W, E, R are your move, rotate, and scales, and Q is your regular selection. So I just like to try to remind you guys of those. I'm going to hold down right mouse button, right? Remember, whenever you hold down right mouse button, particularly over an object, particularly when your cursor's over that object, it will do it specifically for that object, right? So if you hold down right mouse button on the object, you can switch to different selection types, right? Vertex, edge, face, object. And I know we've done this a bunch, and we're going to keep seeing it, right? Because it's great to reinforce those things. So we go to face mode and grab that face, and I can just scale it down a little bit, because you notice how in the picture it gets a little thinner there. Maybe even this back one gets a little fatter, maybe even a little taller that way, right? Remember, you can always left-click drag on any one of these handles to just scale along that axis. The center one scales all 3 at the same time, and these squares scale 2 at a time, right? And that's pretty common. You'll find some version of this in Blender and Modo and 3D Studio Max, right? So basically, these manipulators you're learning, particularly in Blender if you turn on industry compatible, right? If you don't, Blender works really different and weird and annoyingly, actually, for some of those things. Turn on industry compatible, it's awesome. And in this case, you know, I can just put in some extra edge loops here, right? Multi-cut, hold down Control, and you notice I'm putting those edge loops kind of close to the corners, right? And that just makes the shape box here. Of course, I can hold down Control Shift, which I didn't want to that direction. I wanted one here, right? So see how it can kind of sharpen that shape up? And remember, my multi-cut snap percentage size is set to 50 still, so if I hold down Control Shift, it snaps right to the middle, right? Remember, you could change that. 50 is a good, useful one, though. I like it. Just because you're often going to want to snap more to the middle than other things, but totally changeable. And you can see that's kind of a little bit like that, right? You can always do a little more shaping. It looks like there's a little extrusion there for that knob. You can always do that, right? It's kind of one of those things you know how to do these. Sometimes you think you don't know how to do them, but you do. And I can rotate it, right? E for rotate, maybe R for scale to scale it down. And then the actual kind of handle here, that could be like a cylinder, right? So we go to create polygon primitive cylinder. In this case, I'm going to go to the options box for that cylinder, right? And we'll make it on the Z-axis this way. There we go. And here we go. So I'm going through these a little quicker because there's really nothing new. They're not terribly complicated to do. And, you know, like some of these parts you might not have on yours, right? So just kind of trying to remind you guys of how easy it is to actually do a lot of this stuff. And we could rotate this up a little bit to kind of get it to line up a little bit better. And then if we need to, we could always multi-cut, right, to put in an edge loop here, because we do have this kind of bend there. And it's probably better to kind of put a single edge loop in. And then if you hold down right mouse button edge, you can double click on that edge. And if you want, remember, you can set back to world, right? It's just that triangle, and you can switch those. And I could easily just kind of bring this up a little bit to get us that kind of bend we were looking for. Now remember, it should rotate a little bit. In this case, I'll leave this one for the moment. And I'll just put in some extra ones here. So I'll kind of maybe put in kind of one right here. So multi-cut again. And then we could hit W for move. Double left click, right? E for rotate. Actually, in this case, we'll select to rotate. And switch it to world if we want. It's always better default. And you'll notice we can kind of rotate this guy a bit here, right? Just kind of to bend it a little bit there. There we go. If we need, we can always scale it a little bit as well. W for move. Actually, let's scale it back out, though. Made it a little too small. But you said we can kind of add some edge loops in here and bend those edge loops, right? So easily, I could just kind of rotate this edge loop, just kind of bend it a bit. There we go. And then maybe move it out a little bit. And you see we can kind of get that nice little natural bend in there. So it's those kind of little things that you want to remember to do, right? When you're making these things. So I can maybe take that a little bit more, put it in a position. There we go. There we go. Maybe select both of those, move them up. Something like that. All right. So those were just quick sketches because, like I said, it's really just a little bit of a cylinder, a primitive, maybe a little bit of extruding, a little bit of multi-cuts, a little bit of shaping. Stuff that you know how to do, stuff that I don't have to linger on a lot, right? Now the wheels are actually nothing new either, right? We're actually going to basically be doing stuff we've seen before, edit mesh, duplicate faces, creating cylinder primitives. We'll do a little bit of circularize again, right? A bit of extrusions, duplicate special around. It's just one of those cases where it's a little bit more involved than these. So those were kind of nice to get the little quick reminders of, hey, extrude, right? Keep faces together off. And I remember I did these without these edge loops in them. I kept them as a single face here so that the keep faces together would work well for those. Because I knew later on I could come in here and add the extra edge loops, right? To kind of sharpen the shape up a bit. And if you wanted to, and you wanted to adjust this even more, right? Like right here, so if I go to edge mode, right? Hold down right mouse button over edge, double click on an edge loop. If I just try to move this, right, it's not really going to work great. Yeah, we could switch back to object, right? And that would actually give us some good controls for that as well. But what if, like, we rotated that and not in object mode, right? Object's not really going to help us for that. It's going to be like world. So remember, there is, in the mesh tools, slide edge. And I've pointed this out before, right? We've shown this a little bit previously here and there. But if you go to edit mesh tool slide edge tool, it prompts you to drag with your middle mouse button, and you see how it automatically drags along the surface. So I can just double click on an edge loop, mesh tools, slide edge, hold down middle mouse button, and if you drag left or right, it just slides it. And that will work regardless of if this was, kind of rotated on its own, right? So slide actually really does slide along the existing surface, whereas move, even if object, because like I said, object can't always orientate these, right? So if I was to rotate these faces here, and then try to go select this edge loop and switch to object mode, right? See how the object doesn't line up with it anymore, so not really going to work well for us. But we see that mesh tool slide edge tool will still work, right? Because it's actually sliding along these edges here, right? So it's actually sliding along the edges that are perpendicular and adjacent to the selected edges. So it actually does slide along the surface. So keep that in mind. Slide edge tool can be useful in these contexts. If you need to, you've already rotated it and you can't get your manipulator to line up well, right? Slide edge is there. Just, little options just to kind of remind you guys about that stuff. Remember, if you have low res and it's really faceted like this, that's because the smoothing angle between the polygons is pretty low. So remember, that's just mesh display. soften edge, right? Because that'll automatically apply a 180-degree smoothing angle to all faces and the edges that connect them. So it'll smooth shade everything. Just like harden edge will make everything faceted, right? So hard edge kind of is what we already had. So if we go mesh display soften edge, kind of blends the normals, right? So any angle that's below 180 degrees will kind of collectively shade, right? They'll shade next to each other like they're one. And everything below 180 is pretty much all edges. That's why soften edge pretty much smooths the whole thing. Harden edge is 0 degrees, right? So everything's hard. Remember, mesh display, soften harden edges options box, actually you can control the angle, right? So if you really need to control the angle, you can. Usually you're just going to want to soften edges though. Just kind of quick reminder of that in mesh display, just like reverse is there for flipping polygons. All right. Just some quick reminders of that stuff, right? Because we don't really need that much time to build the wheel for the chairs, right? And it's great just to get a kind of reminder of some of those things from earlier classes. All right. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to start to build the wheels. Now, we look at these wheels, and they are cylinders, right, on their sides. So I'm going to go to Create, Polygon Primitive Cylinder. I'm going to go to the options box for that, all right? And the 12 divisions I added for this guy, that's okay, right? It doesn't really matter if they're 12, 10. I probably wouldn't go too nuts because we are going to put it in Smooth Preview. So remember, if you're working in Smooth Preview, leave your divisions lower, right? So that way the Smooth Preview is going to do a lot of the rounding work for you. And that way when you smooth it later on, you're still going to have a pretty efficient mesh, right? If you make a really dense primitive, that kind of gets in the way of the Smooth Preview being a great shortcut because you've already got a bunch of geometry that makes the shape rounded, right? But also you have a lot of edges that you have to work with shaping, right? And if you find shaping the clock radio difficult, imagine if the polygon mesh was 2 to 3 times denser. Really not going to be a lot of fun, right? So keep that in mind. Usually keep those divisions lower. 12 should be okay, though. In this case, we can make it on the z-axis. It should be the x or the z, not the y, because y goes up and down, right? Z and x go this way or this way, right? So z is fine. There we go. And I'm going to move this down, because we do want to keep this on the center for now. So W for move, right? And then you just left-click drag on the green arrow, which is the y-axis. R for scale. And of course I can grab the center one to scale all three at the same time. And you know symmetry's off, right? Particularly when you're working with cylindrical shapes, right? Symmetry can be weird. So I usually have symmetry off when I'm working with cylinders and I work with kind of radial, right? These kind of radiated out as spokes. So symmetry just is going to make all kinds of problems. So usually you should not have symmetry on when you're working with this. And I know I talked about it in the previous video. Just kind of trying to remind you guys about that. So we'll scale it down. And it's okay to have our wheel down here, right? Because we're going to make the wheel, and then we're going to move it here, and then we're going to duplicate special around. Remember F for frame selection, right? F for frame selection. That zooms your camera in and even sets your camera rotate around the selection, right? In this case, it's an object selection, but it works on edge loops, faces, vertices. So F for frame selection works on any selection type, really. In this case, it was object level. So of course I can scale tool still on, R for scale, right? R is the quick key for scale. I could left click drag on that Z axis, right? The blue, the dark blue, just to make it thinner, like a wheel proper, right? I'm gonna hit W to move it up a little bit too, just so it's a little bit closer. And the wheel itself is pretty straightforward and easy. We're gonna kind of separate it off into 2 wheels a little later on, right? But what I want to do, and it's gonna be easier to make this sheath now before we finish the wheel itself up. But that gives us a good kind of starting point for our wheel. Now, of course, I'm going to hit 3 to put it in a smooth preview, right? And we notice we've got a sheath here, right? Kind of a cover, a separate piece. And you notice how it kind of fits the top of that cylinder? So that's what we're going to do, right? We're going to, F for frame selection on that guy. We're going to put our cursor over the wheel, hold down right mouse button, right? Because remember, when you hold down right mouse button, it brings up these selection types, right? Vertex, edge, face, object. You'll even see vertex face, which does that. It's okay. Just switch back to another type and you'll be fine. We'll talk about multi a little more later on. But right now, really vertex, edge, face, object mode. Now, some of you guys have had that green, bright green material problem, right? That's because occasionally certain modeling functions, and it's kind of unpredictable, pops up here and there. No real way to predict it. Basically, sometimes you'll have a green wireframe. Sometimes you'll actually even have it where you can't get out of wireframe mode, right? And often, particularly if it's the bright green polygons, it's gotten confused about the materials, right? So if you hold down the right mouse button, like you're going to select, you'll see there's this whole other menu system down here. And we're actually going to see this a lot more on Project 5. You can assign an existing material. It's the very bottom one, Lambert 1, and that'll assign that gray material. That's everything that's Lambert 1. So all you have to do to fix that usually, particularly if it's the bright green, is just go to the very bottom, assign existing material Lambert 1, all right? If it's kind of a wireframe, usually that'll fix it. Sometimes you might have done something way weird, but oftentimes, particularly if it's just wireframe on some polygons and not all, it's kind of a similar problem, and you used to have to reassign the material. That's kind of on everything. So kind of a quick little side talk, because a couple of you guys have had that problem recently, and I've told it's one of those things I can explain to you over a message. We don't have to do a conference for it. I figure it doesn't hurt to have a video where you can kind of see, hey, right there, boom, and it just reapplies that. So pretty easy fix, but it occasionally will pop up. If you ever get a weird kind of a thing where your vertices go all over the place in Smooth Preview, usually if you hit 1 to turn it off and then 3 to turn it back on, that'll fix it. Sometimes it could be because there's non-manifold geometry. Sometimes it could be that there's just a lot of history on your object, right? So sometimes just go in and delete the type history and maybe clean up your outliner, and that can often fix it. So just keep that in mind, right? It sometimes pops up. Sometimes it depends on the computer, the 3D card. Sometimes it's just that there's a lot of history and you might need to delete history. Sometimes it's as simple as just hitting 1 and then 3 to just kind of clear things out a little bit from Maya. But occasionally your Smooth Preview will kind of go crazy, like it broke and it tried to explode, right? And vertices will be pointing all over the place. It doesn't happen that often, but sometimes it will. Those are the things that I've found that will often fix it. Sometimes not, right? Sometimes you did weird stuff to your geometry, and you might have to rebuild or go and fix that part. But it's kind of, it depends. It doesn't always pop up, kind of thing. All right, so just kind of want to talk about those a little bit in video form so that you guys have access to that discussion a little bit. What I want to do is I want to get this started, and then we'll kind of make a second video to kind of finish the wheel off. But I do want to get kind of the sheath part started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the right mouse button over the object, right? Face mode. And of course, remember we have range selection, right? If you left click on a face and then you shift, right? Because shift adds, double left click on another face kind of along the same face loop, and it's true of edge loops also, so that same thing works for edge loops. If I go to edge mode, select an edge, shift double left click, right? Selects a partial loop, right? So it's just left click on whatever you want to select, just like normal, and then shift double left click, right? So double left click, because that selects edge loops, right? But by holding down shift, right, it kind of does a range function. So that even works for faces. Select the face, left click on it, then shift double left click, right? Of course, if you want to, you can do it one at a time, right? Left click, shift 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 left click, right? Because you have to keep adding one at a time. That's why shift, shift left, shift left. But you can even use drag, right? The quick key for drag is tab. You hold down tab. And you can always just do this quickly as well. So honestly, things like range selection and drag select are faster in these situations. That's why we have them available. They're great selection options. All right. And then what we want to do is we want to copy these polygons into their own mesh. Now the nice thing is we've seen this a couple of times, haven't we already? We're actually still going to see it more before we're done with this semester, right? So if you want to actually duplicate just some of the polygons from a mesh into their own object, it's not going to be edit duplicate, right? The edit duplicate is for objects. Edit mesh duplicate is for faces, particularly when you want just some faces copied. So edit mesh duplicate. And you'll notice by default, it kind of gives you that low res, and you'll see green and white. You're supposed to see that. If you hit Q, right, that'll kind of turn the tool off and go back to your selection tool. And then we can also hit 3, right, because 3 is smooth preview, 1 is low res, right? And you'll notice it's kind of still in face mode, right? So even though it looks like it's on object mode, sometimes Maya is still confused. Remember, these are your selection types right there. There are quick keys for them, F8, F9, F10, F11. But a lot of modelers, including myself in Maya, prefer the marking menu for this stuff, right? Hold down the right mouse button, and there they are. And you just go back to object mode there. In particular, other teachers at Cogs will really prefer the right mouse button one, right? Hold down right mouse button. They will be mad at you if you don't use that. right? So that's why I've kept telling you guys to use this. I keep repeating it. That way I've at least made sure to reinforce it a lot to you guys. But remember, a lot of my users prefer holding down right mouse button to use the marking menu. Just like if you were to do W, left mouse button, right? W, hold down W, left mouse button, you get marking menu for the move options, right? Those are the move options in here. Symmetry can be turned on. You can turn on component, world, all those things, right? So you can kind of do that instead of over here. Up to you. All right, so now we have this as a separate object, and this is a separate object. That's what that edit mesh duplicate does, right? Extract would have cut, right? We saw that on part of our chair, on our door, right, where we wanted them to actually separate it, and there was actually a hole left behind, right? Here we just wanted to copy, right? So edit mesh duplicate is like copy in Photoshop, right? And edit mesh extract is like cut, right? Duplicate just copies it, so the original has everything intact still. There's just new geometry based on that selection. Extract would actually rip this apart off of that and leave a hole behind. And both are great and have their appropriate uses. So in this case, you know, I make sure I'm in object mode, right? Hold down right mouse button, object mode. Click on this sheath here that we've created. And we want to thicken this, don't we? And if we stay in object mode, right? Hold down right mouse button, object mode, green wireframe, and we extrude in object mode thickens, right? Because it notices that all the polygons are selected, so it says there's a 99% chance you want to thicken, which is true. If you only have some faces selected, it's going to do a regular extrusion, which 99% of the time is what you want there also. Now, we've seen that a lot of the times when I extrude stuff, I want to use the regular move and move along world, right? In particular, when we build our character creature, you're going to see that that's really what we're going to want to use. But in this case, for thicken, just like with the spokes themselves we made on the chair, we actually want to use the normal direction, right? So it's kind of like a 70-30 proposition for me, right? 70% of the time, you just want to extrude, switch to a regular move tool, move it a bit, or scale it a bit. You just want to use the regular manipulators and move them in the direction you want. But there are times, like that 30% of the time, like with the spokes and with thickens, that you really want to move along the normal direction, right? And that's the Z-axis, the local translate Z. So if I left-click drag on that, you'll notice all of these faces, right? They move along kind of the way they're pointing. That's what the normal direction is. And he says a number there, so you can type in a number, right? So that's how thicken works, right? And we've seen thicken several times also. Guess what? We'll still see it more later on Project 6 as well. So there we go. It's thickened. We can hit Q to just kind of turn our... Q is a great way to turn off whatever tool you're in and just go back to your regular selection tool, right? So there we go. I think that's a great place to stop this video, and then we'll come back in the next video and finish the wheel off, and in that case, finish the chair off. All right.